Rain slicked the streets of Draven's Reach until they gleamed under the dim yellow of the street lamps. The market lane was almost empty now, stalls shuttered, their awnings sagging under the steady downpour. A few vendors stayed open for dock, workers coming off shift, but their voices were low, muffled by the hiss of rain on metal roofs. The smell of fried batter and wet rope lingered in the air, mixing with the sharper tang of rust from the canal rails. Jonas Morul kept his head down and his hands deep in his coat pockets. His shift at the port registry had run late again, a scheduled audit that refused to end on time. He walked the route home without thinking about it, boots tapping on wet boards, counting the minutes until he could sit in his apartment above the East Canal, with a mug of tea and the sound of the radiator for company. That was when he noticed her, a shape, small and still, tucked between two stacks of crates outside a closed supply stall. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded clothes, but then a pair of eyes, slanted and luminous, catching the lamplight lifted toward him from the shadows. Indigo hair clung to her cheeks and neck, plastered there by the rain. Her violet-toned skin seemed almost gray in the cold. She wasn't shivering exactly, but her bare feet were pale against the warped planks she sat on, and her knees were drawn tightly to her chest. Jonas slowed, instincts pulling in opposite directions. Trouble started this way, stopping for one person meant you were suddenly tied to their problems. Here on Draven's Reach, most people knew to keep moving. But she wasn't moving. He stepped under the stall's awning, rainwater running off the edge in a thin curtain. "How long have you been here?" he asked. His voice was flat, practical. She didn't answer, but her eyes didn't leave him. Her breathing was quick, uneven, like she was deciding if speaking would make things worse. "What's your name?" Her throat worked as she swallowed. Finally, a voice thin, breaking slightly. "She kicked me out, stepmother. I broke a glass." Jonas's gaze flicked over her shoulder into the space between the crates. Nothing there, but he did see the bruise on her shin, fading to yellow at the edges. And tucked just behind her, heel, a cheap kitchen knife. The blade was dull, the handle worn. "I can cook," she said suddenly, almost in a rush. "I can be quiet. I won't misbehave." Her fingers tightened on the knife. "Be my dad." The words landed heavier than he expected. Children didn't say things like that, unless they already knew no one else was coming. He could walk away now, pretend he hadn't seen her. On Draven's Reach, that was the safe choice, the simple choice. But the longer he stood there, the more wrong it felt to leave. "My place is close," he said finally. "It's warm. You can eat and rest there." She didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she reached out not for his hand, but for the hem of his coat. Pinching it lightly between two fingers, she stepped out from the crates, bare feet silent. On the boards, she followed him into the rain, holding that scrap of fabric as if it were the only thread pulling her toward safety. Jonas's apartment was only 6 blocks from the market, but the walk felt longer in the rain. The girl stayed just behind him, coat hem pinched between her fingers, never tugging, never loosening her grip. When a loose shutter banged against a wall in the wind, she flinched and pressed closer, but didn't say a word. They crossed the East Canal over a narrow bridge, the boards slick underfoot. Below, the water moved in sluggish folds, catching the pale reflection of the lamps. A small barge drifted by, its windows lit, shadows of a family eating dinner, blurred by the condensation. Jonas felt her glance toward it, and then away, her steps quickening as if to keep pace with the moving light. His building was a narrow, 3-story brick block with a single flickering light above the entrance. The stairwell smelled faintly of wet stone and paper. They climbed in silence, her hand brushing the wall, testing the texture of the cold plaster. At the second landing, She stopped for a moment to look back down before continuing without a word. Inside, the apartment was warm from the radiator, lined with shelves of ledgers and books. The air smelled faintly of old paper and tea leaves. Jonas hung his coat on the hook and glanced at her. She stood just inside the door, dripping onto the mat, both hands still gripping the bread roll he'd bought earlier and never eaten. "You can leave the knife here," he said quietly. Her eyes widened slightly. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she reached behind her leg, pulled the dull blade free, and set it on the mat. "Not surrender more like agreement." "I'll make soup," Jonas said. "You can get warm by the radiator." She crossed the room with careful, deliberate steps, pulled a blanket from the chair, and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. Even then, she didn't put the bread down. Jonas worked in the small kitchen corner, slicing vegetables, the soft hiss of water heating filling the space. When he set the steaming bowl in front of her, she stared at it for a moment before speaking. "If I spill," she asked, "do I have to leave?" "No," he said, steady and certain. She nodded and began to eat in slow, small spoonfuls. Between bites, her eyes kept flicking to the open door of the spare room. A clean bed waited inside, a folded sweater on the pillow. When she finished the soup, she walked to the doorway, touched the sweater's soft sleeve, then pulled it over. Her head, the cuffs swallowed her hands completely. "If I sleep, will you be here when I wake up?" she asked. "Yes." "People say yes," she murmured. "Then they leave." "I won't." She studied him for several seconds, then sat on the bed without closing the door. Jonas returned to the table, a ledger open in front of him but unread. He could hear her breathing shift, slow and steady. As she drifted toward sleep. In his mind, he began a list: clothes, shoes, food, and at the bottom, something he never expected to write: guardianship forms. Dawn thinned the rain to a mist, soft light spilling through the narrow window above the canal. The apartment smelled of tea and warm eggs. Jonas set a plate on the table and glanced toward the spare room. Ari lay on her side, eyes open, watching the door as if weighing whether the night had changed anything. When she saw him, she pushed the blanket down and sat up slowly. The gray sweater still hung past her knees. Her gaze swept the apartment door, stove, table measuring exits, heat, and food in that order. Then her eyes found the knife he had moved to a high shelf, and she stepped forward to retrieve it. "We'll not need this here," she said simply. Holding it out, Jonas took it and placed it in the drawer beside the spoons, making sure she saw exactly where it went. She watched his hands, filing the location away in her mind. "Sit," he said. "Eat while it's warm." She tucked her feet onto the chair and ate in small, steady bites. In the daylight, the bruise on her shin looked darker, a deep yellow, fading to purple at the center. She didn't mention it, and neither did he. "We need to get you shoes," Jonas said between sips of tea. "Socks, a coat, a brush for your hair. After that, I'll speak to the civic desk about guardianship. I want you safe on paper, not just in this room." Her shoulders rose and fell in a short shrug. "Will they take me away?" "Not if I do this properly," he said. "There's a temporary care form. I've seen it at the registry. I'll sign it, and later a clerk will visit to confirm you live here. It's not fast, but it's clear." She looked toward the spare room, then back at him. "If they come here, do they ask me questions?" "They'll ask if you feel safe. You can tell the truth." "I do," she said. The words landed like a stone placed carefully on a shelf-measured and certain dot after breakfast. Jonas pulled on his coat and checked his satchel. Ari changed into a pair of old leggings he'd bought once as a gift but never used. They bunched at her ankles, but it was better than bare feet in the market. She smoothed the sweater sleeves down and stood near the door, clasping her hands to keep from reaching toward where the knife had been the night before. They stepped into the street. The market was just waking awnings being pulled up, crates shifting across wet boards. No one paid them more than a passing glance. At the clothing stall, Jonas kept his tone practical. Boots, size small, wool socks, raincoat for a child, gloves if you have them. The shopkeeper didn't ask questions. Ari sat to pull the boots on, flexing her toes and testing the fit with the focus of someone checking if they could run in them. The raincoat was dull blue, the hood lined. She pulled it up, blinking at the muffled quiet it gave her. How do they feel? Jonas asked. They feel like I can walk far, she answered. There was no smile, but the tightness around her mouth. Next came the clinic, a small room smelling of antiseptic and paper. The nurse cleaned her shin and checked for deeper damage. Nothing broken, she said, glancing at Jonas. Any guardian on file? Not yet, he replied. I'm filing temporary care papers today. The nurse wrote a code on a slip and handed it to him. Present this at the civic desk. It links today's visit to your application. When they left, Ari's voice was quiet. Will the clinic tell my stepmother? No, they only send notices to listed guardians. Soon, that will be me. The civic office was a squat concrete building 2 blocks from the canal bridge. Inside, the air was warm and stale, crowded with people waiting. At window 3, Jonas handed over the slip and explained. The clerk scanned it, looked at Ari, then passed him a thin packet of forms. Fill sections A through D. Section E is the home check agreement. We schedule within 30 days, often sooner. School placement? Add Form 2B. Ari watched the exchange as if it were a lesson in another language. Jonas wrote his name slowly, aware of the weight of each letter. In the space for name used in home, he wrote simply, Ari. When the forms were done, they stepped back into the gray light. Ari's boots clicked softly on the boards. She held the edge of his coat between 2 fingers again, not out of fear, but as if confirming the path they'd started that morning was real. The West Market was busier than the one near the canal, its lanes wide enough for carts to pass in both directions. The air was thick with scents: roasted nuts, salted fish, the faint chemical tang from a repair shop's open door. Jonas moved steadily through the crowd, keeping Ari just ahead of his left shoulder so he could see her without turning. She had her new canvas bag slung across her chest, one hand on the strap, fingers hooked tight, as if she expected the crowd to tug it away. At a school supply stall, he let her choose a notebook. She picked one with a plain brown cover, flipping it over twice before setting it in the pile. And her eyes fell on a stack of colored paper. She sorted through it without hurry, settling on a single sheet of bright red. She held it flat between her palms. From my desk, she said. No more explanation than that. Jonas didn't press. Some things didn't need questions. They were halfway down the main lane when her pace slowed. Jonas noticed it immediately. Way her shoulders stiffened, chin lowering, head turning just enough to mark something at the edge of her vision. What is it? He asked under his breath. She flicked her gaze toward a fruit stall. She was in my stepmother's once. She tells people things. Jonas's eyes followed hers to a woman in a pale coat, her posture sharp, eyes narrowed in appraisal. Without breaking stride, Jonas stepped between them, his body blocking Ari from view. We're heading to the cloth stall next, he said. In a low, steady voice. Ari stayed close, her breathing shallow until the fruit stall disappeared behind the curve of the lane. In the cloth shop, she stood still while bolts of fabric were pulled down, her gaze scanning the doorway until she was certain the pale coat wouldn't reappear. You don't have to speak to anyone from before, Jonas told her. If they ask questions, tell them to speak to me. What if they tell her where I am? She already knows you're not with her. By the end of the week, the papers will show you live with me. That makes it official. Ari nodded once, but the tension in her shoulders didn't fully leave. Jonas didn't push her to relax. Trust returned in its own time. The shopkeeper laid out several swatches. Jonas told her she could choose for new pillowcases. Ari's fingers moved over the fabrics, pausing on a pale gray with a faint grid pattern. It doesn't show crumbs, she said. Voice matter dash of dash fact dot on the way back. Jonas stopped at a food stall. The steam from the buns curled into the damp air. Ari ate hers standing at the counter, her bag still slung across her front. She chewed slowly, scanning the crowd less often now, the lines around her mouth easing dot by the time they crossed the bridge back to their side of the canal. Her silence was no longer tight with worry. It was simply quiet dot at home. She placed the notebook and pencils on the middle shelf she'd claimed in the spare room, lining them parallel to the edge. The red paper she carried to her desk, sliding it into the center and smoothing it flat with both hands. Jonas leaned in the doorway. Something to look at during lessons? It's a mark, she said without looking up. So I know the desk is mine. That evening, over dinner, she asked, when the home check happens, do I have to tell them about my stepmother? Only if they ask. You can say no comment, and they'll move on. She thought about it, then said, I'll just tell them my room's quiet, and I have my sweater. Jonas gave a small nod. That would be enough dot before bed. She zipped her canvas bag and placed it beside her boots on the shelf. It's ready. If I need it, she said. No explanation. Jonas didn't ask for one. The morning of the home check came with a steady, cold rain that blurred the edges of the canal outside the window. Jonas had been up early, moving quietly around the apartment, not staging it for inspection, but making sure nothing looked out of place. The kitchen counters were clean, the ledgers stacked neatly on their shelf, and Ari's boots sat side by side on the mat beneath her chosen shelf in the spare room. Her sweater and canvas bag were there too, arranged with the precision she preferred. Ari dressed without prompting. She chose the pale gray sweater, the leggings, and the boots. She smoothed the sleeves down, tugged them once, then again, as if to set them exactly right. When Jonas handed her a hairbrush, she took it and worked through every tangle until the bristles moved without catching. She didn't ask if she looked good. She asked, Do I look normal? You look like you live here, Jonas said. That's all they need to see. The knock came exactly on time. Ari froze halfway between the couch and the table, her shoulders stiff. Jonas opened the door to a woman in a dark civic coat, a tablet in one hand, her ID badge clipped to the lapel. L. Carvin, Housing Compliance, Temporary Care Review, she said. Jonas stepped aside. This is Ari. Ari gave a small nod, her hands clasped behind her back. Carvin's eyes moved over the apartment, pausing at the radiator, the full pantry shelves, the neatly hung coats by the door. We'll start with the child's sleeping space, she said. Ari led the way to the spare room. She stopped just inside while Carvin scanned the bed, the desk with the red paper centered on it, and the shelf with her things. Do you have what you need here? Carvin asked. Yes, Ari said, voice steady but brief. Do you feel safe here? Yes. Carvin glanced at Jonas. Food in the kitchen? He opened the pantry and refrigerator, showing staples, fresh produce, and a few extras from the market. Carvin made notes on her tablet, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. Clothing is appropriate for the season. Medical record from the clinic is linked to this file. No concerns about hygiene. Then she looked at Ari again. Has anyone here ever made you feel unsafe or unwelcome? Ari's fingers tightened together, then loosened. No, she said. This is my home now. Jonas kept his face still, but the weight of those words landed deep. Carvin tapped her screen one last time, then explained the next steps. Final approval within a week. Guardianship status extended until renewal in 12 months. No interim checks unless requested. She handed Jonas a printed copy of the visit summary when the door closed behind her. Ari stayed where she was, eyes fixed on the lock until Jonas turned it. Then she exhaled hard and walked straight to her desk. She placed both hands on the red paper, pressing it flat as if anchoring it in place. She didn't ask about my stepmother. Ari said she didn't need to, Jonas replied. You told her what mattered. Ari nodded once. Does this mean I can start school now? Yes, it means you're officially part of this household, and they'll register you this week. That night, Jonas noticed her bedroom door was open wider than ever before. Not just a crack halfway. The space between them was closing, and it wasn't by accident. Several weeks passed after the home check, and the apartment began to settle into a rhythm that no one had to name. Ari woke on her own for school, boots laced tight, sweater sleeves. Neat. She no longer asked if Jonas would still be there when she returned. She simply came home, dropped her bag on the floor beside her shelf, and went about her homework or small chores. The silence between them was no longer wary. It had become part of the space, as comfortable as the hum of the radiator. One gray afternoon, she appeared in the doorway with her coat zipped, boots on, and her canvas bag across her chest. I want to go to the corner shop, she said. Jonas looked up from the ledger he was sorting. All right, he said, alone. He studied her expression. There was no challenge in it, no testing of limits, just a measured certainty. What do you need? Bread, the kind you buy. I have the money. She held up 2 coins exact. Change for a loaf. The shop was only 2 turns away, but it meant crossing the side lane and speaking to the shopkeeper herself. He weighed the risks, then nodded. You tell me when you leave, and you come straight back. No stopping. Ari gave one small nod and opened the door. Jonas moved to the window, watching her cross the side lane, pausing for a delivery cart. She kept her head up, one hand in her coat pocket, the other gripping the coins. When she reached the shop, she disappeared from view. The minutes stretched, and he had to stop himself from going after her. Then she emerged, paper-wrapped loaf in hand. She looked both ways before crossing back, steps quick and sure. When she reached the door, she handed him the bread without a word. Was the shopkeeper polite? Jonas asked. Yes. He asked if I wanted the smaller loaf. I said no. I want the kind you buy. Jonas unwrapped the bread, inhaling the smell of the fresh crust. And how did it feel? Like I could do it again, she said simply, and hung her coat and boots neatly on their hooks. They ate the bread with dinner. Ari tore her piece carefully, so the slices stayed whole. When the plates were cleared, she sat cross-legged on the couch, watching him move between the table and the kitchen. Then, without warning, she darted behind the couch and flung a cushion at his legs. Jonas stopped mid-step, looking over the back of the couch to see her crouched with the other cushion. Held like a shield. So this is war? It's a game, she said, her grin quick and mischievous. You can't catch me. They circled each other for nearly half an hour, soft impacts and quick laughter bouncing off the walls. He caught her on the third pass, pulling the cushion from her hands and pretending to guard it like a prize. She twisted in his grip, laughing hard, and managed to snatch it back before retreating to the spare room. Finally, she dropped onto the couch, breathless, cheeks flushed. Jonas sat beside her, handing over the last cushion in a gesture of truce. She leaned back, sweater cuffs pulled over her hands. You're good at this, she said. I've had practice avoiding thrown things, he replied, And she laughed again, softer this time. There was a pause, not empty, but waiting. She looked up at him, voice quieter now. "You know you're my dad, right? Not just because of the papers, because I say so." Jonas didn't move for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Then I'm your dad, because you say so." She leaned her head against his arm, still catching her breath. "Thanks, Dad," she said, the word deliberate. Testing how it sounded out loud, Jonas felt something shift inside him, not a sudden change, but the quiet confirmation of something that had been true for months. By the time spring began to edge into the air over Draven's Reach, the apartment no longer felt like the quiet, spare place Jonas had kept for years. Now it held the sound of Ari's school bag thumping to the floor in the afternoons, the occasional clatter of pencils rolling across her desk, the low murmur of her voice as she read aloud to herself or worked through math problems. The shelf by the radiator had grown crowded, her boots neatly lined beside her canvas bag. A folded paper bird from a classmate, a smooth piece of canal glass, a silver button she'd found on the walk home. On a clear Saturday morning, Jonas was at the table, sorting a stack of ledgers, when Ari came out of her room with her hair pulled into 2 uneven braids, clearly done herself. There was a sly glint in her eyes as she positioned 2 cushions in the corner. "What are you planning?" Jonas asked. "Nothing," she said too quickly. Nothing turned out to be an ambush. A soft thud hit his legs as he crossed the room for more tea, and Ari darted back behind the couch, holding the other cushion like a shield. The game began again, cushions flying, Ari darting between the couch, her desk, and the spare room. Laughter sharp and quick in the small space. When they finally called a truce, Ari collapsed onto the couch, cheeks flushed, sweater cuffs tugged over her hands. Jonas sat beside her, and she leaned against him without hesitation. Later, while Jonas washed the dishes from lunch, Ari went to her shelf. She shifted her notebook, her pencils, the red paper she still kept perfectly flat, then reached for her canvas bag. From it, she pulled a folded strip of paper, worn at the creases. She stood for a moment, turning it in her hands, then carried it to the table. "This was my plan," she said. Jonas dried his hands and sat, taking the paper carefully. Inside was a neat list, written in small, deliberate letters. Bread, sweater, knife, map to dock, hiding place behind grain store. Beside it was a simple map, lines marking alleys and turns away from his building. "I made it the first week," Ari said, "in case you changed your mind." Jonas looked at her, but she wasn't avoiding his eyes. Her voice was calm, steady. "I don't need it anymore." She tore the paper cleanly in half. Then again, the sound of the fibers giving way loud in the quiet room. She carried the pieces to the small trash bin by the door and let them fall in. When she turned back, she was smiling, not the fleeting twitch he'd seen before, but something small and certain. She went to her desk and began a new drawing, pencil moving in confident lines. When she finished, she brought it to him. It was the 2 of them at the table, bread between them, the square of red paper in the center. She had given herself the sweater and boots. She'd given him the chair by the window, the canal behind his shoulder. "Can I put it on the wall?" she asked. "Wherever you like," he said. She pinned it above her desk, just above the drawing of the apartment and the map to the shop. Then she stepped back, hands on her hips. "That's the last one," she said. "I don't need more pictures to remember. I know it now." That night, when she went to bed, she left her door all the way open. Not a crack, not halfway wide. Enough that the warm air from the radiator reached her room. She didn't glance at the lock or the window. She just climbed under the blanket, sweater sleeves pushed back from her hands, and closed her eyes. Jonas stood in the doorway for a long moment before turning off the light. The apartment was quiet, but no longer empty. She was home. And so was he.